The airport was alive with the hum of engines, the chatter of travelers, and the rhythmic roll of luggage wheels against polished floors. It was a place where stories intersected, some mundane, others extraordinary. Among the bustling crowd at Los Angeles International Airport, Sarah blended in like any other traveler. She wasn't the kind of person who turned heads. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest navy dress paired with comfortable flats. Her only accessory was a small silver necklace that glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman on an ordinary journey. But Sarah wasn't ordinary, not by a long shot. She approached the check-in counter for her flight to New York with quiet confidence. In her hand was a first-class ticket, neatly printed and tucked into a leather wallet. It had been years since she'd flown first class, and though she wasn't one to indulge in luxury, today felt different. Today, she allowed herself this small treat, a chance to relax and enjoy a bit of comfort on her journey. The line moved slowly, giving her time to observe the people around her. A businessman in a tailored suit tapped impatiently on his phone. A family with 2 young children struggled to keep their toddlers entertained. A young couple whispered excitedly about their honeymoon plans. Sarah smiled softly to herself, feeling a quiet sense of camaraderie with these strangers who were all embarking on their own adventures. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward and handed her ticket to the airline agent behind the counter. The woman glanced at Sarah, then at the ticket, and then back at Sarah again. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I'm sorry," the agent said after an awkward pause. "There seems to be some mistake." Sarah frowned, confused. "A mistake? What do you mean?" The agent hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line as if choosing her words carefully. "This is a first-class ticket," she said slowly, as though Sarah might not understand. "Yes," Sarah replied patiently. "That's correct." The agent's gaze flickered over Sarah once more, taking in her plain dress, her scuffed flats, and her unassuming demeanor. There was no malice in her expression, but there was something else, doubt. "I'll need to verify this," the agent said curtly before turning away to consult with a colleague. Sarah stood there in stunned silence as whispers began to ripple through the line behind her. She could feel eyes on her, curious, judgmental, pitying. Heat rose to her cheeks as embarrassment settled like a heavy weight in her chest. She wanted to explain herself, to assure everyone that there was no mistake, that she belonged here just as much as anyone else, but the words caught in her throat. Minutes passed like hours before the agent returned with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Unfortunately," she said briskly, "we won't be able to accommodate you in first class today." Sarah blinked in disbelief. "What? Why not?" "It's just company policy," the agent replied vaguely, avoiding eye contact. "Company policy?" Sarah repeated incredulously. "I paid for this ticket fair and square." The agent's smile faltered slightly, but remained plastered on her face. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," she said mechanically before handing Sarah a new boarding pass. This one for economy class. For a moment, Sarah didn't move. She stared at the boarding pass in her hand, as if it were some kind of cruel joke. Around her, the murmurs grew louder, a low buzz of speculation and judgment that seemed to echo in her ears. Finally, she stepped aside, clutching the downgraded ticket tightly as she made her way toward the economy check-in line. Her steps felt heavy now, each one weighed down by humiliation and frustration. As she waited in line once more, this time surrounded by passengers bound for cramped seats and limited legroom, she couldn't help but replay the interaction over and over again in her mind. The disbelief in the agent's voice when she saw Sarah's first-class ticket, the way she had scrutinized Sarah's appearance as though searching for proof that she didn't belong, the dismissive tone when she explained away what had happened with vague references to company policy. It wasn't just about being denied a seat in first class. It was about what it represented, an assumption that someone like Sarah couldn't possibly deserve such luxury or privilege simply because of how she looked. She glanced around at the other passengers waiting with her, some dressed casually like herself, others clad in business attire or designer labels, and wondered how many of them had faced similar judgments based on appearances alone. As much as she tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on getting through security and onto her flight without further incident, they lingered like shadows at the edges of her mind. Unshakable reminders of how easily people, could be underestimated or dismissed based on surface impressions alone. Little did anyone know, including Sarah herself, that this unassuming woman standing quietly among strangers held within her life experiences far richer than most could imagine and secrets that would soon come to light in ways no one could have anticipated. For now, though, for this fleeting moment, she remained just another face in the crowd, overlooked by most, yet quietly carrying within herself untold strength and resilience born from years spent navigating life's challenges with grace and dignity. And while others might see only what lay on the surface, a plain dress, scuffed shoes, an unremarkable demeanor, they would soon learn just how wrong first impressions could be and how much more there was beneath those unassuming layers waiting patiently for its time to shine through against all odds. Sarah's life had always been one of quiet simplicity, a life that many might overlook, but one that carried its own profound beauty. Before the events at the airport, before the whispers and judgmental stares, Sarah had lived in a way that defied the expectations of those who equate worth with wealth or appearances. To understand Sarah now, standing humiliated in the economy line, you'd have to go back to where it all began, back to the small town where she grew up and the values that shaped her into the woman she became. Sarah was born in a modest home on the outskirts of a sleepy Midwestern town. Her parents were hard-working people, her father a mechanic who spent long hours fixing cars in their garage, and her mother a school librarian with a love for books that she passed down to her daughter. They didn't have much, but they had enough. Their lives were built on honesty, kindness, and an unshakable belief in treating others with respect, no matter their station in life. From an early age, Sarah was different. She wasn't drawn to the flashy or extravagant. Instead, she found joy in the small things, a walk through the woods behind their house, the smell of old books in her mother's library, or the satisfaction of helping her father fix an old engine. She was the kind of child who would save her allowance not for toys, but to buy flowers for a neighbor who had lost a loved one. Her parents often said she had an old soul, wise beyond her years. As she grew older, Sarah's path remained unassuming but purposeful. She became a teacher at the local elementary school, where she poured her heart into shaping young minds. Her classroom was a sanctuary of creativity and compassion. She wasn't just teaching math or reading. She was teaching her students about kindness, resilience, and the importance of seeing beyond what meets the eye. People are like books, she would tell them. You can't judge them by their covers. It was during these years that Sarah met David. Their meeting was as unremarkable as it was life-changing, a chance encounter at a community fundraiser where David had been invited as a guest speaker. At first glance, they couldn't have been more different. David was polished and confident, his tailored suit and commanding presence marking him as someone accustomed to success. Sarah, in her simple dress and quiet demeanor, seemed almost invisible beside him. But David noticed her. In a room full of people vying for his attention, it was Sarah's genuine curiosity and warmth that drew him in. They talked for hours that night, not about business or wealth, but about books, travel, and their shared belief in giving back to others. David found himself captivated by her authenticity, a quality so rare in his world of high-stakes deals and endless ambition. Their courtship was unconventional by most standards. David didn't woo Sarah with expensive gifts or grand gestures. He knew she wouldn't be impressed by such things. Instead, he showed up at her classroom with lunch when she worked late or spent weekends helping her paint murals for her students. Sarah loved him not for his wealth or status, but for his heart, the way he listened when she spoke, and how he treated everyone around him with respect. When they married, Sarah insisted on keeping their life together as grounded as possible. Despite David's immense wealth, something she only fully understood after they were married, she refused to let it define them. They lived in a beautiful but modest home compared to his peers' sprawling estates. Sarah continued teaching for several years after their wedding, much to the confusion of those who couldn't understand why a billionaire's wife would choose such a path. But Sarah wasn't interested in living up to anyone else's expectations. She knew who she was and what mattered to her: family, community, and staying true to herself. Even after she eventually left teaching to focus on charitable work alongside David, she remained fiercely committed to simplicity and humility. Yet this commitment wasn't without its challenges. There were times when Sarah felt out of place in David's world, a glittering sphere of galas and boardrooms where appearances often mattered more than substance. She hated how people looked at her sometimes, as if she were just the wife, someone who didn't belong because she didn't flaunt designer clothes or drop names at every opportunity. But Sarah never let those moments define her. She wore what made her comfortable and spoke when she felt she had something meaningful to say. Over time, even David's most skeptical colleagues came to respect her, not because of who her husband was but because of who she was. Still, there were moments when Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of others' assumptions about her, a weight that would come crashing down on her at the airport years later. As Sarah stood there now, clutching an economy-class boarding pass that felt like an indictment against everything she believed about fairness and dignity, her mind drifted back to those early days with David. She thought about how far they'd come together and how much they'd overcome not just external challenges but also the internal struggle to stay true to themselves amidst constant scrutiny. She thought about what her mother used to say, "The world will try to put you into boxes based on what they see on the outside. But remember this, your worth isn't something anyone else gets to decide." And yet here she was, reduced once again to someone else's judgment based solely on appearances. What no one at that airport knew, what no one could possibly guess, was just how much strength lay beneath Sarah's unassuming exterior. They saw only what they wanted to see, a plain woman in simple clothes who didn't seem like someone who belonged in first class. But Sarah knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. Because while others might see humility as weakness or simplicity as lack of ambition, Sarah understood them for what they truly were, strengths that grounded her amidst chaos and gave her clarity when others faltered. And though this moment stung deeply, a painful reminder of how easily people could be underestimated, Sarah also knew it wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The hum of the airplane engines echoed faintly in the background as Sarah sat silently in the crowded economy-class waiting area. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her downgraded boarding pass, the sting of humiliation still fresh in her mind. She had done her best to keep her composure, but the weight of the judgmental stares and whispered comments lingered like a shadow over her. She felt invisible yet exposed, as though the world had decided she didn't belong. The irony was almost laughable. Here she was, a woman who had spent her life advocating for kindness and fairness, reduced to a caricature by someone who judged her worth based on nothing more than her appearance. But Sarah wasn't one to dwell on bitterness. She reminded herself that this moment, painful as it was, didn't define her. It was just another chapter in a story that was far from over. As she stared at the boarding pass in her hand, lost in thought, a commotion began to stir nearby. At first, it was subtle, a murmur of voices, the hurried footsteps of airport staff moving with purpose. But within moments, it grew louder and more chaotic. Heads turned, passengers whispered to one another, and Sarah looked up to see what was happening. A group of airline employees was approaching, their faces tense and urgent. At the center of their hurried movement was a man, a tall figure in a tailored suit with an air of authority that seemed to command attention wherever he went. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned on her. It was David, her husband. The sight of him here, at this moment, felt surreal. David wasn't supposed to be at the airport. He had meetings scheduled halfway across the country. And yet here he was, striding toward her with purpose and determination etched into every line of his face. "Mrs. Carter," one of the employees addressed her hesitantly, their tone suddenly deferential. Sarah nodded slowly, still trying to process what was happening. "We deeply apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced," the employee continued, their voice trembling slightly under David's piercing gaze. "There's been a misunderstanding." David stepped forward then, his presence filling the space around them like a tidal wave. His expression softened slightly as his eyes met Sarah's, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath his calm demeanor. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah nodded again, though she wasn't sure if it was entirely true. "I'm fine," she managed to say. David turned his attention back to the airline staff, his tone shifting from gentle to commanding in an instant. "I'd like an explanation," he said firmly. "How exactly did this misunderstanding occur?" The employees exchanged nervous glances before one of them stammered out an apology about company policies and procedural errors, words that sounded rehearsed and hollow even as they were spoken. David listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but his silence heavy with unspoken judgment. When they finished their explanation, he spoke again, this time addressing not just the staff but everyone within earshot. "My wife," he began, his voice steady and clear, "is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. She is kind, intelligent, and compassionate, a woman who has dedicated her life to helping others and making the world a better place." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. She also happens to be married to me. His tone shifted slightly, then still calm, but with an edge that hinted at restrained anger. And as you may or may not know, I own this airline. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd around them as realization dawned on those who had been watching from afar. The whispers grew louder now, speculation about who Sarah really was and how anyone could have made such an egregious mistake. David ignored the murmurs and focused solely on Sarah. "You deserve better than this," he said quietly but firmly. "And I'm going to make sure you get it." Before Sarah could respond or protest, before she could tell him that none of this mattered as much as he thought, it became clear that David's words weren't just empty promises. Within moments, arrangements were being made, apologies issued by senior staff members, first-class accommodations restored, assurances given that such an incident would never happen again. But even as these gestures unfolded around her, gestures meant to rectify what had gone wrong, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had been revealed in this moment, not just about how others saw her, but about how she saw herself. She had always believed in humility, in living simply and treating others with respect regardless of status or wealth. But now she wondered if there were times when standing up for oneself wasn't just necessary but vital. As David led her toward the first-class lounge, a space that now felt both foreign and familiar, she glanced back at the economy waiting area where she had been sitting just moments ago. The faces there were still watching her, some curious, others envious, a few perhaps ashamed for having judged her so quickly. She wanted to say something then, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what success or worth looked like. So she stopped walking and turned back toward the crowd. "Thank you," she said simply, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone who had been part of this moment in some way. "Thank you for reminding me why it's so important to see people for who they really are, not just what they look like or where they come from." Her words hung in the air like a quiet challenge, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that true worth often lay hidden beneath layers of assumption and prejudice. And with that simple statement, a statement born from both pain and resilience, Sarah turned back toward David and took his hand. Together they walked away, not just toward first class, but toward something far greater, a renewed commitment to living authentically and challenging others to do the same. Because while this chapter of their story might have begun with judgment and humiliation, it ended with something far more powerful, truth revealed, and dignity reclaimed. The plane soared through the clouds, leaving the chaos of the airport far behind. From her seat by the window in first class, Sarah gazed out at the endless expanse of sky. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, but her mind was far from quiet. The events of the past few hours played on a loop in her head, the judgmental stares, the dismissive tone of the airline staff, David's sudden appearance, and his impassioned defense of her. It had been a whirlwind, and now, as the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah found herself reflecting on what it all truly meant. She turned her gaze away from the window and looked around the first-class cabin. It was a world of polished surfaces and quiet luxury, where passengers sipped champagne and reclined in plush leather seats. But beneath the veneer of sophistication, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many of these people carried their own invisible burdens, how many had been judged unfairly or underestimated because they didn't fit someone else's idea of who they should be. Her thoughts were interrupted by David's voice. He was sitting beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, offering him a small smile. "I'm fine," she said. And she meant it, at least in part. She was fine, but she was also something more, resolute. "David," she began after a moment's hesitation, "what happened today, it wasn't just about me." He tilted his head slightly, his expression curious but attentive. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "It wasn't just about me being treated unfairly because of how I look or what I was wearing. It's about how often people are judged, dismissed, because they don't fit into someone else's narrow definition of what success or worthiness looks like." David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're right," he said quietly. "It happens all the time. And it's not just me," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's everyone who's ever been told they don't belong because they don't look the part or because someone assumes they're less than they really are." David squeezed her hand gently. "You've always seen people for who they are," he said. "That's one of the things I love most about you." Sarah smiled again, this time with more warmth. "And you've always believed in standing up for what's right," she replied. "Which is why I think we need to do something about this. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Sarah said thoughtfully that we have an opportunity to make a difference, to use what happened today as a catalyst for change. David leaned back in his seat, considering her words. He had always admired Sarah's passion for helping others and her unwavering commitment to fairness and equality. If anyone could turn a moment of personal pain into something meaningful for others, it was her. "What do you have in mind?" he asked after a moment. Sarah hesitated briefly before answering. "I want to start a campaign," she said finally. "Something that challenges people to look beyond appearances, to see each other as individuals with unique stories and experiences." David's eyes lit up with approval and admiration. "I think that's a brilliant idea," he said. Over the course of the flight, their conversation evolved into something more concrete, a plan to launch an initiative that would promote empathy and understanding across communities and industries alike. They discussed ideas for workshops and seminars that could be held at schools, workplaces, and even within their own airline company, a chance to educate people about unconscious bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. By the time they landed in New York, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to turn what had been a painful experience into something transformative not just for herself, but for others as well. As they disembarked from the plane and walked through the terminal together, Sarah noticed something remarkable. People were looking at her differently now, not with judgment or pity, but with curiosity and perhaps even admiration. Word had spread about who she was and what had happened earlier that day, and while part of her disliked being the center of attention, another part recognized that this moment could be used to amplify her message. In the days that followed, Sarah and David wasted no time putting their plan into action. They reached out to community leaders, educators, business executives, even celebrities, who shared their vision for creating a more compassionate world where people were valued for who they were rather than how they looked or what they owned. The campaign quickly gained momentum, fueled by stories from individuals who had faced similar challenges in their own lives, stories that resonated deeply with audiences across social media platforms and beyond. Through it all, Sarah remained true to herself, humble yet determined, kind yet unyielding in her pursuit of justice and equality. And while there were moments when she doubted whether one person, or even one campaign, could truly make a difference in such a vast and complex world, those doubts were always outweighed by her belief in humanity's capacity for growth and change. One evening several months later, long after the incident at the airport had faded into memory, Sarah stood on stage at an event celebrating the success of their campaign. She looked out at the audience before her, a diverse group of individuals united by their shared commitment to building a better future. As she began to speak, her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Today," she said softly but firmly, "we celebrate not just what we've accomplished together, but also what we've learned along the way. That every person has value, that every story matters, and that when we choose to see each other with empathy instead of judgment, we create space for connection and ultimately for change." The room erupted into applause as Sarah stepped back from the microphone, but even as she smiled at those around her, she knew this was only the beginning. Because while one moment at an airport might have sparked this journey toward greater understanding and compassion, it was clear now that its impact would ripple far beyond anything she could have imagined, reaching hearts and minds across generations yet to come. And so Sarah stood there, not as someone defined by wealth or status, but as someone whose quiet strength had inspired others to see themselves and each other in a whole new light.